They left her to rot in the winter snow for daring to shelter a starving, nameless boy. The Redfern pack called her a disgrace. But their laughter died in their throats the day the Alpha King's royal vanguard breached their gates, and the ruthless sovereign fell to his knees. The winter of 1244 was merciless, a sprawling expanse of white death that choked the northern territories and brought even the hardiest of werewolf packs to their knees. Within the Redfern pack, survival was not a guarantee. It was a daily, brutal contest of dominance and submission. At the absolute bottom of this vicious hierarchy was Isolde. Isolde was an Omega, though she had not been born to the title. Her parents had been respected warriors who perished in a border skirmish years ago, leaving her orphaned and unprotected. In the harsh reality of medieval pack law, a child without protectors was merely a burden. Alpha Gideon, a vain and cruel leader who ruled the Redferns with a heavy, unyielding hand, had stripped her of her family's rank the moment she came of age. She was banished to the drafty, rotting outbuildings of the pack's fortress, forced to scrub their furs, tend to their dying fires, and eat the marrowless bones left behind by the hunters. It was during the apex of the Great Frost, when the wind howled like a dying beast through the ancient pines, that Isolde's life irrevocably changed. She had been sent to the frozen banks of the Whitewater River to break the ice and wash the soiled linens of the high-ranking females. Her fingers were cracked and bleeding, her breath pluming in the freezing air when she caught the scent. It was not the familiar, musk-heavy scent of a wolf, nor the sharp tang of a deer. It was the distinct, metallic odor of human blood, mixed with something else, something ancient, like ash and crushed iron. Following the scent through the waist-deep snowdrifts, Isolde found him. He was a boy, no older than 12, half buried in a snowbank beneath the roots of a massive oak tree. He was frighteningly frail, his skin the color of old parchment, his lips a violent, bruised blue. He wore rags that looked as though they had once been fine silk, now shredded by briars and stained with dried blood. He had no wolf scent. To the acute senses of the Redfern pack, he was nothing but a human stray, the lowest form of prey. Isolde dropped to her knees, her heart hammering against her ribs. Pack law was absolute. To bring a human into the territory, especially a useless, dying one, was an offense punishable by exile. And exile in this winter meant a slow, agonizing death. But as she reached out, the boy's eyes fluttered open. They were a striking, unnatural shade of amber, though clouded with fever and pain. He did not cry out. He did not flinch. He simply looked at her with an exhausted, quiet resignation that shattered Isolde's heart. He reached out a trembling, frostbitten hand and gripped her frayed sleeve. She didn't think about Alpha Gideon. She didn't think about the pack's laws. Isolde scooped the fragile boy into her arms, wrapping him in the meager warmth of her own tattered cloak, and carried him back to the fortress. Her arrival was met with immediate, visceral disgust. Gareth, the pack's lead enforcer, and a brute whose face was mapped with jagged scars, blocked her path to the servants' quarters. He sneered, his yellow eyes flashing with predatory amusement. "What kind of vermin have you dragged into our home, Isolde? Are the Omegas so desperate for company they keep human trash as pets?" A crowd of wolves gathered, their laughter echoing off the stone walls of the courtyard. Isolde held the boy tighter to her chest, trembling from both the cold and terror. "He is freezing, Gareth. He's just a child. Let me pass." "Drop the carcass, Isolde," Gareth growled, stepping closer, the threat of a shift vibrating in his chest. "Or I'll tear his throat out myself and save the winter the trouble." What is the meaning of this disruption? The courtyard fell dead silent as Alpha Gideon descended the stone steps of the main hall. He was draped in the pelt of a massive brown bear, his presence suffocating and arrogant. He looked at Isolde, and then at the shivering bundle in her arms, his lip curling in profound distaste. "An Omega brings a diseased human whelp into my stronghold," Gideon said, his voice a lethal purr. "Have you finally lost what little mind you had, Isolde?" "Alpha, please," Isolde begged, dropping to her knees on the icy cobblestones, carefully cradling the boy. "He is dying. He takes up no space. He will stay in the darkest corner of the kitchens. I will share my rations with him. He will cost the pack nothing. Fiona, Gideon's favored female, stepped out from behind the alpha, her laughter high and grating. She wants to play mother to a stray. Let her keep it, Gideon. When it dies of the rot in 3 days, we can make her dig the grave with her bare hands. Gideon considered this, a cruel smile touching his lips. To him, Isolde was a plaything, a necessary fixture to absorb the pack's frustrations. Allowing her to suffer the inevitable heartbreak of watching the boy die was a fitting punishment for her audacity. Listen closely, Omega, Gideon commanded, his voice echoing in the freezing air. You may keep your stray, but he is your burden entirely. He receives no medicine, no fresh meat, no firewood from our stores. If he steals so much as a scrap, I will have Gareth flay him alive, and when he dies, you will drag his corpse into the woods yourself. Isolde bowed her head, tears of relief and fear freezing on her cheeks. Thank you, Alpha. She carried the boy into the damp, lightless cellar beneath the kitchens, laying him on a bed of dirty straw. As she frantically rubbed his hands to restore circulation, the boy looked up at her, his amber eyes burning through the gloom. I am Rowan, he whispered, his voice raspy, but entirely devoid of the fear a human should possess in a den of monsters. I am Isolde, she replied, pressing a damp cloth to his fevered brow. You are safe now, Rowan. I promise you. She had no idea that her simple act of mercy had just sealed the fate of the entire Redfern pack. The weeks that followed were an agonizing test of endurance. Rowan did not die, much to the bitter disappointment of the pack, but his recovery was agonizingly slow. He remained terrifyingly thin, his ribs showing through his pale skin, a persistent cough rattling in his chest. Yet, there was something deeply unsettling about the boy that Isolde couldn't quite understand. He never cried. Even when the cellar dropped to freezing temperatures, or when Isolde returned with nothing but a handful of stale crusts for them to share, Rowan accepted his reality with a stoic, aristocratic grace that seemed entirely misplaced in a starving stray. He watched the wolves of the Redfern pack with a quiet, analytical intensity. When Gareth or the other enforcers came down to the kitchens to terrorize Isolde, kicking over her buckets of water or throwing dirt on the linens she had just washed, Rowan would stand in the shadows, his amber eyes tracking their every movement. He had no wolf scent. He could not shift. By all accounts, he was weak. Yet, the enforcers subconsciously avoided making eye contact with him. The mockery, however, was relentless. Isolde became the pack's favorite target of humiliation. They called her the bitch mother of the stray. During the communal feasts, when the pack tore into freshly roasted venison in the Great Hall, Isolde and Rowan were forced to sit in the dirt outside the doors, subjected to the biting wind and the jeers of passing wolves. Look at them, Fiona would sneer, tossing a gnawed bone into the mud at Isolde's feet. Two pathetic creatures. You should eat it, stray. It's more than you deserve. Isolde would reach out to pull Rowan back, to shield him from the cruelty, but the boy would simply stare at the bone, then up at Fiona. His gaze was so piercing, so devoid of submission, that Fiona would often falter, a flicker of inexplicable unease crossing her features before she turned away in a huff. Do not look at them like that, Rowan, Isolde would whisper frantically, pulling his ragged collar up around his neck. They will kill you if they think you are challenging them. Rowan would look at Isolde, his expression softening only for her. They are false wolves, Isolde. They feast while their own starve. They rule through fear, not strength. Hush! Isolde hissed, terrified someone would hear. That is the way of the world. We just have to survive. But the world outside Oakhaven was shifting, trembling under the weight of a far greater terror. Spring was approaching, and with the slight thaw came the traveling merchants and solitary rogues seeking refuge. They brought with them whispers from the capital that chilled Alpha Gideon to the bone. King Valerius of the Obsidian Court was on the march. King Valerius was a living legend, a pureblood alpha whose lineage traced back to the first shifters. He was a warlord of unparalleled savagery and unyielding honor. 10 years ago, his mate, the Queen, had been ambushed and murdered by a coalition of traitorous rebel packs. During the chaos of the slaughter, their only son, the crown prince and sole heir to the obsidian throne, had vanished. For a decade, the king had been a phantom of vengeance, tearing the continent apart, eradicating rebel strongholds, and executing alphas who harbored treason. The rumors said Valerius had grown mad with grief, his beast entirely taking over the man. And now, his royal vanguard was sweeping through the northern territories, inspecting every pack, demanding loyalty, and searching for any trace of the lost prince. Alpha Gideon grew paranoid. He ordered the fortress scrubbed, the defenses fortified, and the pack forced into relentless drills. The Redferns had to present an image of flawless discipline and prosperity. If King Valerius found weakness, or worse, dissension, he would slaughter the entire pack and give their lands to someone else. In his frantic preparations, Gideon's eyes fell upon Isolde and Rowan. To the Alpha, they were a stain on his perfect stronghold, a disgraced Omega, and a human stray living in his cellars. 2 days before the king's vanguard was expected to arrive in the valley, Gideon summoned Isolde to the courtyard. The entire pack stood at attention. "The king of the Obsidian Court approaches," Gideon announced, his voice tight with anxiety. "We will show him the strength of the Redferns. We will show him perfection." He turned his cold gaze to Isolde, who was holding Rowan's hand tightly. "Which means we will not have our stronghold contaminated by vermin." Gareth stepped forward, a heavy iron chain in his hands. "You and the human will be confined to the root cellar beneath the eastern watchtower until the king departs," Gideon commanded. "You will not make a sound. If Valerius even catches a whiff of your pathetic existence, I will not wait for him to leave. I will execute you both myself." Isolde's blood ran cold. The root cellar beneath the eastern tower flooded during the spring thaw. It was freezing, filled with rats, and completely devoid of light. "Alpha, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "The water is waist-high in the tower. Rowan is still weak. The dampness will kill him." Gideon moved faster than lightning. His hand snapped out, backhanding Isolde across the face with brutal force. She flew backward, hitting the cobblestones hard, blood instantly welling from her split lip. Laughter erupted from the pack. Fiona smiled triumphantly, but the laughter died instantly. A low, vibrating sound resonated through the courtyard. It wasn't a growl, it was a pressure, a sudden, suffocating shift in the air that forced the breath from the lungs of every wolf present. Gareth stumbled back, dropping the iron chain. Gideon's eyes widened as he looked around, trying to locate the source of the immense alpha aura that had suddenly crashed down upon them. It was emanating from the boy. Rowan stood over Isolde's fallen body. He had not shifted. He had not grown claws or fangs. But his amber eyes were glowing with a terrifying, blinding gold, the undeniable, unmistakable mark of royal blood. "Do not touch her," Rowan said. His voice did not sound like a 12-year-old boy. It sounded like an avalanche. It carried the weight of 1,000 generations of apex predators. Gideon's jaw went slack. For a split second, his wolf submitted, his knees buckling under the sheer, oppressive weight of the boy's command. But Gideon's arrogance was fatal. Realizing the pressure was coming from the human stray, his shock turned to violent rage. "You dare use some dark trickery on me in my own territory?" Gideon roared, his claws extending as he lunged forward, intent on ripping the boy in half. But a horn sounded in the distance, a massive, earth-shattering blast that echoed off the mountains. The king had arrived early. The blast of the war horn shattered the tension in the courtyard like a hammer against glass. Gideon froze mid-lunge, his furious gaze darting from the glowing eyes of the boy to the massive iron gates of the fortress. The heavy thud of marching boots and the rhythmic pounding of armored direwolves shook the ground. "Open the gates!" Gideon bellowed, panic fully overriding his rage. He whirled on Gareth, pointing a trembling claw at Isolde and Rowan. "Get them out of sight! Now! Throw them in the dirt behind the stables. Gag them if you must. Move." Isolde, head spinning and mouth tasting of copper, scrambled to her feet. She grabbed Rowan's arm, pulling him back. The boy's eyes were still glowing that terrifying, unnatural gold, his gaze fixed on the heavy timber doors of the gate. He didn't resist Isolde, but he didn't cower either. He allowed her to pull him into the deep shadows of the stable alley, just as the massive gates groaned open. The pack scrambled into perfect submission lines, heads bowed, throats exposed in a display of absolute subservience. Gideon stood at the forefront, his posture a pathetic mix of pride and profound terror. Into the courtyard rode the vanguard of the Obsidian Court. They were monsters in the shape of men. Towering warriors clad in dark, heavy armor, their cloaks the color of dried blood. They rode massive, scarred direwolves that dwarfed the Redfern shifters. The air instantly grew heavy, thick with the scent of old wars, ozone, and absolute dominance. The sheer aura of the royal guard pressed the Redfern pack to their knees. But the guards were merely the prelude. The ranks parted, and King Valerius rode in. He was a terrifying sight. Broad-shouldered and lethal, the Alpha King possessed a rugged, devastating beauty that was entirely overshadowed by the sheer violence radiating from him. His hair was dark as midnight, his eyes a cold, piercing silver that missed absolutely nothing. He wore no crown, only a heavy mantle of black wolf fur, a grim testament to the traitors he had personally executed. He dismounted with predatory grace, his boots hitting the cobblestones with a resounding thud. Silence blanketed the fortress. Not even the wind seemed to dare make a sound. Gideon dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead almost to the dirt. "My king," he groveled, his voice shaking. "The Redfern pack welcomes you. We are your loyal servants. Our hearths are yours. Our meat is yours." Valerius did not look at Gideon. He began to walk slowly down the line of kneeling wolves. His silver eyes swept over the bruised faces, the thin frames of the lower-ranking members, and the opulent furs worn by Gideon and Fiona. He was reading the truth of the pack, seeing through the polished facade to the rot underneath. "Loyalty," Valerius spoke, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the chests of everyone present, a word easily spoken by alphas who gorge themselves while their omegas freeze. Gideon swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "My king, the winter has been harsh. We have done what we must to ensure the survival of the strong." Valerius stopped pacing. He stood in the center of the courtyard, slowly inhaling the freezing air. The king's senses were legendary. It was said he could smell a lie on a man's breath from a mile away. He closed his eyes, filtering through the scents of the courtyard. Fear, sweat, wood smoke, roasted meat. And then, his eyes snapped open. The cold silver of his irises flared. From her hiding spot behind the stables, Isolde clamped a hand over her own mouth, terrified her breathing would betray them. She held Rowan tightly against her side. Her lip was still bleeding from Gideon's strike, a single drop of blood falling onto the snow. Valerius turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto the exact shadow where Isolde and Rowan were hidden. "What is that scent?" Valerius demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. Gideon panicked, his head whipping around. "Scent, my king? We slaughtered a fresh stag in your honor. The kitchens are preparing." "Silence!" Valerius roared. The force of the command sent Gideon sprawling into the mud, clutching his throat as the king's aura crushed him. The king took a step toward the stables. His royal guard immediately drew their weapons, forming a protective wedge. But Valerius waved them back. He walked past the kneeling, trembling forms of Gareth and Fiona, his focus entirely on the dark alleyway. "I smell fresh blood," Valerius said, his voice trembling with an emotion that no one had seen in the king for 10 years. It wasn't rage, it was desperation. "I smell the blood of an Omega, and beneath it..." The king's breathing became erratic. He stepped into the shadows of the stables. Isolde squeezed her eyes shut, pulling Rowan behind her in a futile attempt to shield him. She prepared for the end. She prepared for the Monster King to tear them apart for daring to exist in his presence. Please, Isolde whispered, stepping out of the shadows and dropping to her knees, keeping her head bowed to the snow. Have mercy. He is just a boy. I found him in the snow. He means no harm. Punish me, but please, let the boy live. Valerius did not look at her. He stood frozen, towering over them. Slowly, Rowan stepped out from behind Isolde. He did not bow. He did not lower his eyes. He stood tall in his ragged, filthy clothes and looked directly into the silver eyes of the Alpha King. You took your time, Rowan said softly, his amber eyes flashing with that undeniable, pure gold light. The courtyard held its breath. They expected the king to sever the boy's head for his insolence. Gideon, watching from the mud, felt a surge of manic relief. The stray had just signed his own death warrant, and Isolde's with it. But King Valerius, the warlord of the Obsidian Crown, the most feared predator on the continent, let out a sound that shattered the hearts of his hardened vanguard. It was a choked, agonizing sob. The king's knees hit the icy ground with a heavy thud. He ignored the mud, ignored his royal mantle, and reached out with violently shaking hands. He pulled the fragile, filthy boy into a crushing embrace, burying his face into Rowan's neck. My son, the Alpha King wept, his tears freezing in the boy's ragged hair. My heir, I have found you. In the courtyard, Alpha Gideon stopped breathing. Gareth's face drained of all color. Fiona clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream of pure, absolute horror. The pack had mocked her. They had starved him. They had beaten the woman who saved him, and they had ordered the crown prince of the realm to be thrown into a flooded cellar to die. King Valerius slowly pulled back from his son. He looked at Rowan's hollow cheeks, his bruised wrists, and the thin rags that offered no protection against the winter. Then his silver eyes shifted, landing on Isolde. He saw her bleeding lip, the bruise forming on her cheek, and her cracked, frozen hands that had fought to keep his son alive. When Valerius rose to his feet, the weeping father was gone. The king turned to face Alpha Gideon and the Redfern pack, and the air in the courtyard ignited with the killing intent of a god. The air in the courtyard did not merely grow cold, it fractured. The suffocating pressure of King Valerius's alpha aura descended like a physical crushing weight, buckling the cobblestones beneath his boots. The wind itself seemed to die, terrified of drawing the king's attention. Valerius did not scream. He did not roar. His fury was far too ancient and profound for something as simple as noise. He slowly turned his back on the shadowed stables, stepping into the weak winter sunlight, his silver eyes locking onto the trembling form of Alpha Gideon. Commander Hastings, Valerius spoke, his voice dangerously soft, yet it carried to the farthest parapets of the fortress. From the ranks of the vanguard, a massive warrior, heavily scarred and bearing the crest of the royal house of Kensington, stepped forward. My king. Secure the gates, Valerius ordered, his gaze never leaving Gideon. No one leaves Oakhaven, not the enforcers, not the elders, not the pups. If a crow attempts to fly over these walls, shoot it from the sky. At once, sire, Hastings replied, gesturing swiftly to his men. The heavy iron gate slammed shut with a deafening boom, the locking mechanism dropping into place like the door of a tomb. The vanguard wolves spread out, drawing heavy broadswords that glinted wickedly in the light. Gideon was still on his knees, his face pressed so hard into the frozen mud that his skin was tearing. Mercy, he wheezed, the word barely escaping his constricted throat. My king, we did not know. The boy carried no scent. He looked like a human beggar. We were only protecting the borders of your kingdom from disease. Valerius closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He reached down, grabbing Gideon by the thick fur of his bear pelt, and hoisted the massive alpha into the air with one hand as if he weighed nothing. You did not know? Valerius repeated, his voice vibrating with a lethal hum. He tilted his head, his silver eyes boring into Gideon's terrified, bloodshot gaze. You saw a starving, freezing child in the snow, and your first instinct was to let him rot. You saw an Omega wrap him in her only cloak, and your instinct was to punish her. You speak of protecting my kingdom? You are a parasite feeding on the carcass of my land." Rowan stepped out from the shadows, his small hand firmly holding Isolde's. Isolde was trembling violently, the adrenaline fading to leave behind sheer, unadulterated shock. The boy who had slept in the rat-infested straw beside her, the boy she had smuggled crusts of bread for, was the obsidian heir. "Father!" Rowan's voice rang out, clear and aristocratic, completely cutting through the terror of the courtyard. Valerius did not drop Gideon, but he turned his head, his expression softening instantly at the sound of his son's voice. "Speak, Rowan." Rowan pointed a thin, dirt-stained finger at Gareth, who was trying to subtly crawl backward toward the armory. "That one kicked over our water buckets and threatened to tear my throat out on the day Isolde found me." Gareth froze, a whimpering sound escaping his throat. Rowan's finger moved to Fiona, who was openly sobbing into her hands. "That one threw chewed bones into the dirt and told me to eat them like a dog." Finally, Rowan looked at Gideon, suspended in the air by the king's iron grip. "And that one," Rowan said, his amber eyes flaring with royal gold, "commanded Isolde to lock me in the flooded root cellar beneath the eastern tower so you would not see me. When she begged him for mercy because I was sick, he struck her." The silence that followed was absolute. Valerius looked at Isolde. He saw the swelling bruise on her cheek, the fresh blood dripping from her chin, the torn fabric of her dress where she had thrown herself onto the icy stones to protect his son. Something within the king snapped. It was a terrifying, silent fracture. Valerius dropped Gideon. Before the Alpha could even hit the ground, the king's boot slammed into his chest, pinning him to the cobblestones. The sickening crack of ribs echoed through the courtyard. Gideon screamed, a wet, gargling sound of pure agony. "Commander Hastings," Valerius commanded, his voice dead of all emotion. "Sire." The enforcer known as Gareth, Valerius said, gesturing vaguely. "Tear out his throat, leave his body for the scavengers." Gareth scrambled to his feet, shifting mid-leap into a massive gray wolf, desperate to fight his way out. But Hastings was faster. The royal vanguard moved with supernatural speed. Hastings didn't even shift. He drew his blade and swung in a single, fluid arc. The heavy thud of Gareth's severed head hitting the snow caused several of the Redfern wolves to scream in terror. Fiona collapsed entirely, crawling on her belly toward Isolde. "Please!" she shrieked, clawing at the hem of Isolde's tattered skirt. "Isolde, please tell them! I was only jesting! I didn't mean it! We are pack! We are sisters! Beg the king for me!" Isolde looked down at Fiona, the woman who had tormented her for years, who had made a sport of her misery. Isolde felt no triumph, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. She gently pulled her skirt from Fiona's grasp. "We stopped being sisters the day you let a child freeze for your own amusement, Fiona." Valerius nodded to his guards. Two vanguard warriors hauled the screaming Fiona away toward the dungeons. The king looked down at Gideon, who was gasping for breath beneath Valerius's boot. "Pack law states that an alpha who brings dishonor and endangers the royal bloodline is to be challenged and executed," Valerius said coldly. "But you are no alpha. You are a coward who rules by terrorizing those weaker than yourself." Valerius removed his boot, stepping back. "Shift," he commanded. Gideon coughed up blood, staring up at the king in horror. "My king, I am broken. I cannot fight you." "I said shift!" Valerius roared, the sheer force of the command forcing Gideon's bones to snap and reform. Against his own will, Gideon transformed into a large, brown-furred wolf, though he was entirely flattened against the ground, his tail tucked between his legs, whining in absolute submission. Valerius didn't bother shifting. He drew a heavy, rune-inscribed hunting dagger from his belt. He knelt beside the trembling wolf and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. "You are stripped of your rank," Valerius whispered into Gideon's ear, loud enough for the trembling pack to hear. "You are stripped of your name. You will live the rest of your pathetic days in the obsidian mines of the capital, chained in the dark, just as you intended for my son." With a swift, brutal motion, Valerius sliced off Gideon's left ear, the universal mark of a banished, disgraced wolf. Gideon howled in agony as the vanguard immediately threw him into heavy iron chains, dragging him away to the prison wagons. The Redfern pack was left leaderless, terrified, and entirely at the mercy of a king whose wrath they had personally invited. The blood in the snow was a stark reminder of the cost of cruelty. The remaining members of the Redfern pack knelt in the freezing slush, waiting for the executioner's blade to fall upon them all. King Valerius wiped the blood from his dagger with a piece of cloth and sheathed it. He took a deep, steadying breath, his chest heaving as the beast within him slowly settled back into the depths of his mind. He turned around, his royal cape billowing in the wind, and walked slowly toward the stable alley. Isolde instinctively took a step back, her heart hammering. He was the king. He was a warlord who had just dismantled her entire pack's hierarchy in under 5 minutes. She was just an Omega, a disgraced orphan in ruined clothes. But Rowan refused to let go of her hand. The crown prince stepped forward, pulling Isolde with him, forcing her to stand before his father. Valerius stopped 2 feet away from them. He looked at Rowan, reaching out to gently touch the boy's hollow cheek. "You are so thin, my son," Valerius whispered, his voice cracking with a father's sorrow. "I searched the entire continent. I burned forests to the ground looking for you. I was trapped in the human realms," Rowan explained softly, "hunted by the rogues who killed Mother. I lost my wolf trying to survive the silver traps. I walked north until I could not walk anymore. I would have died under that oak tree." Rowan looked up at Isolde, squeezing her hand. If not for her. Valerius slowly shifted his silver gaze to Isolde. The lethal, terrifying warlord vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, humbling gratitude. To the absolute shock of the vanguard and the utter disbelief of the kneeling Redfern wolves, King Valerius dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow. He bowed his head, placing his right hand over his heart in the highest gesture of royal reverence. "My king, no!" Isolde gasped, stepping forward in panic. "You must not kneel to me. I am an Omega. I am nobody." "You are the savior of the Obsidian Court," Valerius corrected, his deep voice thick with emotion. He reached up, unfastening the heavy clasp of his royal mantle, a magnificent cloak of thick, black wolf fur lined with silver silk. He stood up and gently draped it over Isolde's trembling shoulders, immediately wrapping her in an intoxicating, fierce warmth. "You risked the wrath of your alpha, you endured starvation, and you took blows to protect a boy you thought was a human stray," Valerius said, looking into her eyes. "You showed the mercy that my own kind had forgotten. You are no Omega, Isolde. Not anymore." Valerius turned to face the terrified remnants of the Redfern pack. "Hear me!" The king's voice boomed over the courtyard. "The Redfern pack, as you know it, is dead. Its cruelty is a rot that I will burn away. From this day forward, this territory belongs to the crown." He reached out, taking Isolde's hand, leading her to the center of the courtyard, right where Gideon had stood only moments before, in all his arrogant glory. "By the power of the Obsidian Throne," Valerius declared, "I elevate Isolde of the North. She is no longer an outcast. She is granted the title of High Warden of Oakhaven. She speaks with my voice. She rules with my authority. Anyone who disrespects her, anyone who defies her, answers to the edge of my blade." The gasps from the remaining pack members were audible. The wolves who had forced her to sleep in the cellars, who had made her wash their clothes in freezing water and eat their scraps, were now staring at their new ruler. "Bow to your warden!" Commander Hastings barked, drawing his sword and slamming the hilt against his shield. One by one, the Redfern wolves pressed their foreheads to the mud, exposing their throats in absolute submission to the woman they had broken. They trembled, waiting for the retribution they knew they deserved. They expected her to order them to the dungeons, to starve them just as they had starved her. Isolde looked down at the sea of bowing wolves. She felt the heavy warmth of the king's mantle on her shoulders, and the small, trusting hand of the crown prince in hers. She looked at the faces of those who had tormented her. "There will be no more starvation in Oakhaven. Isolde's voice rang out, surprisingly steady and clear. The cellars will be opened. The sick will be treated. We will survive the rest of this winter together. But the old ways of cruelty are finished. If you cannot live with kindness, you will leave my lands. Valerius looked at Isolde, a profound respect blooming in his silver eyes. She was not a warrior, but she possessed the heart of a true alpha, a heart that protected the weak. Rowan smiled, leaning against her side. I told you they were false wolves, Isolde, the prince whispered. Now you will show them how a true leader rules. The vanguard blew their horns, a triumphant, ringing sound that shattered the bleakness of the winter sky. The sun finally broke through the heavy clouds, casting a warm golden light over the courtyard. Isolde, the disgraced Omega, stood tall beneath the banners of the Obsidian Court, a stray no more, fiercely guarded by the most powerful wolves in the world. If you loved this story of justice and ultimate revenge, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling werewolf romance, dramatic twists, and stories where the underdog finally gets the crown. What would you have done if you found a stray in the snow? Let us know in the comments below, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update.